So it's an honor and a pleasure to be here today speaking at the Women Transforming Technology Conference. And today is a very special day, not just because I get to be here in front of all of you, but also today is my 10th month anniversary of beginning my first job directly out of college. Yeah. Now, I know what you're all thinking, 10 months? What could you possibly have to teach me about the workplace? Yes, well, I'm pretty sure that my area of expertise at this point in time is in the field of expertise. And I fully embrace that. I fully acknowledge that I have so much room to grow and to learn and develop as an adult. However, just because I am young and just because I might have less experience than my counterparts doesn't mean that I don't have a voice. You see, I think that as young people, we are conditioned to put our heads down and grind to produce a work output. That's sort of the rules we live by in corporate America. However, I also think that's a very narrow way of thinking about your role. Instead, I believe we as young people need to begin to take the same level of accountability and responsibility that is required of senior leaders, because there's simply too much at stake in corporate America at this time for us to sit back and take an idle role. You know, I think about this very unique moment in time in which I've emerged into this workforce. And this period has been characterized by endless exposés into the toxic culture that is rampant in our organizations throughout the country, from sexual harassment to cases of gender and racial inequality. See, if we're not training ourselves to stand up now, then we're never going to be able to stand up in the future. And that is exactly what I want to speak to you all about today. This topic is very personal to me because at an early age, even younger than I am right now, I'm 23 years old, I was exposed to the harsh realities of what it means to navigate corporate America, not only as a woman, but as a person of color. And I want to challenge you all to put yourselves in my shoes for a few minutes while I share with you this really eye-opening story that has forever changed the way I approach my work, the way I think about myself. So years ago, during one of my summer internships during college, I was finishing up a 12-week-long program, working approximately 85 hours per week, trying desperately to prove my capabilities and earn a spot at the company. And by all strokes of the imagination, I was doing everything I needed to do to get the offer. And I was seeing that in my feedback. I was exceeding expectations on all of my presentations. I was networking like a pro. I had met with the CEO and had recurring one-on-ones with senior leaders to talk about initiatives they were scaling out nationwide. And I was getting really stellar feedback. So by the end of the summer, I was really disappointed to find out that I hadn't actually received the offer. And what I was even more disappointed about was the explanation behind why. And I remember sitting in a room across from the senior executive, who was the head of the program, and when he was explaining why I didn't receive it, he simply said, and this is verbatim, "You know, you did well, but you're a minority. Ultimately, you're used to getting what you want, and sometimes it just doesn't work out that way. So we'll see you some other time, hopefully down the road. Have a nice summer."
Don't want to work for him.
That's exactly right. Now, you're probably all thinking,
Wow.
what did I do in this scenario, right? Well, I didn't stand up for myself, that's for sure. And at that age, I didn't have the words or the wherewithal to even know where to begin. And it wasn't until I left the room, till I even realized that he was using my identity, who I was, as a justification for why I didn't belong, not my performance or how I was perceived or the contributions that I had made that summer. And because that was so deeply personal and offensive, it affected me for a long time. I became very paranoid. I started thinking that I had to do everything perfectly in order to compensate for what this man had said to me in a brief 5 minutes. Right? And it started to affect my mental health. It took a toll on my relationships with my family and my friends. I became very depressed. But coming out of that experience, I ultimately learned two very important lessons that I don't think people learn until much later in their careers. And those two lessons are, one, it doesn't matter how well you're performing or how positively you're perceived in an organization. If you're not in a place that values your identity, or values you for your differences, not in spite of your differences, then your chance of success is going to be very small. And secondly, if you allow those toxic cultures and those toxic people to change your own definition of self-worth, then you're going to be in an even more precarious position. So coming out of that, I think back now, and I'm very grateful that I had that experience. I had to be exposed to the harsh realities of the nastiness that's actually out there. And I look at where I'm at now. I'm at LinkedIn, a place where I feel empowered to make a difference, empowered to use my voice for change. We are a company that is specifically about creating economic opportunity for the global workforce, something that is directly aligned with my passion. But just because I'm in a better place now doesn't mean that I can afford to become complacent. I have to continue to drive a culture of inclusion everywhere I go, or else that experience that I had in the past would have been in vain. So the goal of today is to inspire us all to action, for us to hopefully learn something and change the way we act when we go back to our organizations. And we're going to get there by answering two important questions. So the first question is, what does driving change in a culture of inclusion in our organizations actually mean? And the second question is, how do we implement and scale this change throughout our organizations? So let's begin to answer the first question on what change actually means. Well, it's impossible to talk about cultural change in our organizations at this particular point in time without thinking about how change is being enacted on a societal level. And why is this? Well, change in society and change in organizations are inextricably linked, right? We know that work and life have become increasingly integrated through technology and globalization, which have created heightened transparency into what's going on at work and what's happening around the world, whether it's positive or negative. A recent example of this is Starbucks. So Starbucks will be closing down 8,000 of its locations because a couple of weeks ago, 2 African-American men were wrongfully arrested when they were sort of victims of racial bias and racial profiling. And what resulted was a viral social media outcry bringing attention to this instance of racial profiling that put pressure on Starbucks' CEO to address the situation and institute these racial bias and inclusion trainings. So as we can see, events that are happening on a societal level are beginning to have a really positive impact in what's happening internally within our organizations. And if we look more broadly into the current cultural moment, right, and we think about what it's defined by, the current cultural moment is defined by this very essence of resistance, of speaking truth to power and holding institutions accountable, just like Starbucks. It's defined by social movements, many of which have been galvanized by social media, which have prompted national dialogues and have been very effective in shifting public perceptions and opinions. If we examine sort of the range of social movements that are present right now, such as the Me Too movement, which is advocating against sexual harassment and sexual abuse, or the Black Lives Matter movement, which is advocating against the police brutalization of African Americans, or even the gay rights movement, we can begin to see patterns of similarities between what they want. And all social movements start with a group of people who became marginalized in part by their identity, or for completely their identity, who've mobilized themselves and have created a platform to actually speak truth to their real experiences. But the other similarities that are between social movements are the values that they're striving for. And generally, doesn't matter which distinct movement you're a part of, what political aim you have, most of them advocate for equality, whether that's gender equality, racial equality, equal protection under the law, justice, fairness, or inclusion. Those are the same patterns we're beginning to see take shape in this next generation. But if we want to peel back another layer of this and examine what social movements mean on an actual fundamental and humanistic level and what they actually strive for, it's one very important factor, which is identity affirmation. Through all of these movements, people are saying, who I am matters. My identity is important. It has equal value and it belongs within my community. Everyone wants to feel valued and as though they have a place where they belong. And this is not different from what we want in the workplace. Humans don't stop being human once they enter the office. At least that's what I've seen so far. I can't confirm. I've only been here 10 months. So So why do I bring up social movements, and what do we learn from them, right? Well, how we can use them to apply to the social change that we want to create in our organizations is we can learn that, the social change that's happening right now is broadly going to shape the values and ideals of the future generations. And those future generations are going to be the people who are filling talent pipelines and leadership roles in the future. We're at a very unique point in time where 4 generations of people, so traditionalists, baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials are working together at the same time. And with that multitude of generations working together, you have lots of clashes. So if the values that we strive for in life or in society aren't aligned with the values that we have at work, that leaves room for a toxic culture to persist, which costs employees their mental well-being, their satisfaction, their happiness, and it ultimately, like in the case of Starbucks, costs the organization reputational damage and the bottom line. So in order to figure out more how these values are aligned, let's actually look at some data to support what millennials want in the workplace. So 22% of millennials want to make a positive impact on their organization. We don't come to work just to make a living anymore. We come to drive impact. 64% of us say that it's a priority to make the world a better place. Most millennials want a global imprint, and technology has allowed us to do this at a scale that's bigger than ever. 88% want work-life integration, not just work-life balance. And this is important because we want to be able to feel as though we can bring our whole selves to work, and that the organizations that we work for uphold and uplift the values that we hold dear. And lastly, 47% of millennials want diversity inclusion at work. And there's a lot of room to move the needle here, but only 22% of millennials can currently say that they work in a diverse environment. So when we think about how to go creating change in our organizations, we have to remember the fundamental key to social change, which is identity affirmation. And we have to lead with the question of how do we make sure that we are affirming the identities of everyone present here? And through that active mindset of constantly affirming, that's the way that we gradually get change. So let's begin to answer the second question, which is how do we begin to implement these change initiatives within our organizations? Well, ultimately, the way that we're going to do this is going to follow a completely different model than what we've seen happen in society, right? We can look to social movements to inform our policies or our rhetoric around what we want to drive. But ultimately, the way we go about advocating for change in an organization is going to be in a different environment. And the first thing that's really important to know here is you have to frame your initiative. You have to start with the why. So whatever you want to change about your organization or whatever you want to communicate, you have to ask yourself, why is this change needed and what's wrong with the status quo or how things are currently run? You then have to ask yourself, is this change initiative that I want to create in line with the values of the business? Because if it's not, your idea is going to fall on deaf ears. The second most important thing is communicating your initiative. And your messaging and your tone should be solution-oriented and optimistic. Whenever you're trying to appeal to a group of people who have some authority to make change, you can't approach them in a defensive manner because that closes people off. Instead of retroactively looking back to examine the wrongs that people made in the past, you have to supply and provide a path forward to how to correct it. Secondly, you should communicate your initiative in the appropriate forum where your voice is most likely to be heard and affirmed. This forum could take the shape of a town hall or a one-on-one with a manager or a peer. You could even start with an anecdote to help contextualize the importance. So starting from a personal standpoint always helps make the connection. Thirdly, and Rashim and Patty both touched on this earlier, so I'm glad I'm reiterating it, you have to galvanize your allies and your sponsors. And there's a difference between the two. So your allies are going to be your early adopters, your peers, people who are equally as excited as you to make a change in your organization and will spread that change organically throughout it. And your sponsors are going to be your senior leaders, people who agree with your why, who have the authority and the influence to influence policy within your organization. And lastly, and this is most important, you have to build the tools to sustain your initiatives and measure the impact and success of them. So it's not enough just to introduce an idea or introduce a policy, right? You have to establish benchmarks along the way so that you can know how much impact you're driving in the organization. In order to do this, many people have conducted cultural assessments. They've done focus groups where you're getting an accurate read on your social climate and your environment. You can hire external consultants whose job it is to come in to conduct an audit of your culture and basically provide a recommendation for you on how to move forward. You can establish leadership councils and community partnerships. But ultimately, it's most important to remember that you have those data and metrics for success to be able to say, hey, I contributed this to the solution. I contributed X, and this is why we should continue to do it as we go forward. So ultimately, those are just a few of the tools I have used to help me continue to drive a culture of inclusion everywhere I go. But ultimately, change begins with you. It's a mindset. And in today's socio-political climate, we have to know always where we stand in relation to the world around us. We must have an impulse to stand up and to stand out, to speak up and speak out. Because only when we begin to disrupt the status quo do we actually become useful to the future generation. So with that, I would like to close and open it up for questions if anyone has it.
Anybody have any questions? I have one.
Okay.
Thank you. So, your example of what happened to you.
Yeah.
What would you say right now? What would you be your reaction given the 10 months you've been on the job and the things that you've learned recently? How would you reply to that gentleman?
I get asked that question a lot, and my response is always, it's not appropriate to say right here. No, but honestly, you know, I would have continued in the conversation. I would have said, interesting, why do you actually think that way? Because I want to pinpoint the exact moment in his logic where he just goes off on this tangent and makes these wild assumptions about who I am and what my life experience has been, and basically prevent him from going down the path of just disregarding all of the work that I had done to get to that point. And whenever I find myself in these unsavory situations where someone has made an assumption about who I am or what I have done, I've learned to not have the knee-jerk reaction, right? Because that doesn't get anyone anywhere. I've learned, and this is sort of the burden of almost my identity, of being a minority, of someone who is underrepresented, of having to teach people and educate them about what my experience truly is, because they're going to make an assumption about it anyway. And if I'm not willing to present them or educate with them with that information, then they're just going to continue to make those assumptions about other people. So even though I think a lot of people of color and a lot of women have this burden of constantly having to educate other people and tell and speak truth to actually who they are, it's something that I've had to adopt and hold true and hold as something that I'm going to commit myself to doing, because that's the only way that change actually happens. Questions? Okay. Great. Thank you.